Let's have a bit of a test here. Aha, the technology works. Thank you very much. Hello everybody. Could I just ask everyone to take their seats now? We're about to get underway with the formal part of the event. Please be aware this event is being publicly live streamed as well as photographed and videoed. So please, our online guests who are joining us, please feel free to share the link with anyone who might be interested in joining us. Or if they want to watch it later, the whole event is going to be recorded and available on the Link Wentworth website. So if you want to check out anything that you've missed, you can access that by Googling Link Wentworth Big Housing Debate. My name is Juanita Phillips. I'm very happy to be here today in front of a live audience. It is still a novelty, let me tell you. Great to see you here. I will be your host today for this important event. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land where we meet today and pay respects to their elders past and present. To get us started, I would like to welcome the Chairman of Link Wentworth Housing, Mike Allen, to the stage. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Juanita. I have a very simple task this morning, and that's to, on behalf of the whole Link Wentworth family, to welcome you here to this special event this morning, to thank you for your attendance and to thank our speakers for their participation. Before I introduce Auntie Carol Cooper for our Welcome to Country, can I just remind people, please, to turn your phones off or turn them on to silent. I have a very embarrassing memory of speaking at a shelter conference once when a phone started ringing and I was up on the stage thinking, who's that guilty party? Before I realised it was my pocket that was making the noise, so I don't want anyone else to be similarly embarrassed. It's very important that we have a welcome to country, and we do appreciate Auntie Carol Cooper being with us here this morning. It's not only culturally appropriate for us to acknowledge country, but it's also very topical for our discussions today, because sadly our First Nations people remain some of the most disadvantaged citizens in our community when it comes to meeting their housing needs. Could I welcome Auntie Carol Cooper to the stage to give us the Welcome to Country. Thank you.
I seem to have this affection against mics.
We just see the guy up the top. Yep. He's going to count you in. We're good. Okay, thank you.
Oh, I can go now. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not used to this. It's quite a big venue for me. Yeah, my name's Carol Cooper. I'm both Darug and Gundungurra from the Blue Mountains. I'd like to welcome you here today, pay respects to our elders past, present and future. The future more than anything, because they're our children, and we're hoping that these sort of forums are going to help our children in the future. We find it very hard to get on in life as it is, but if we can have your listening, your planning of things that could help us to come, that would be very much appreciated. The kids are the greatest, and we are doing very well in a lot of academic stuff that people don't even hear about. So for today, I thank you very much for coming, but I thank you very much for inviting me here to do the welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie Carol, for being here and for that beautiful welcome and important message. Before we get started, I'd also like to acknowledge the distinguished guests that we have here today. We're joined by Councillor John Thane, the Deputy Mayor of Penrith City Council, Shane Mallard, MLC, Rose Jackson, MLC, Susan Templeman, MP, the Member for Macquarie, Adrian Harrington, the Chair of the NHFIC, Trish Doyle, the Member for Blue Mountains, Chris Velakos, the Registrar of Community Housing, Umair Ahmad, Director of Community Housing DCJ, Peter Poulet, Central City and South District Commissioner, Greater Sydney Commission, Councillor Patricia Prokiev, City of Parramatta, Councillor Penny Patterson, the City of Ryde, and of course we've already heard from Mike Allen, the Chair of Link Wentworth. Well, as you know, we are here today to have a discussion about one of the most critically important issues, not just for Western Sydney, but for the whole nation, affordable and social housing. In my work as an ABC broadcaster, it's one of those stories which is never out of the news, never out of our news, certainly. We know that this country is in the midst of a housing affordability crisis, which has gone on for years, which is getting worse, and which impacts all generations and all demographics. Every day we hear about a new aspect, whether it is astronomical house prices, soaring rents, working families living in a caravan because they can't find a rental property, vulnerable people forced into homelessness and waiting many, many years for social housing. The recent flood catastrophe in the state's north, which destroyed or damaged around 3,000 homes, has only exacerbated the crisis, particularly for vulnerable and marginalised communities. Western Sydney is one of the fastest growing and one of the most diverse populations in Australia, so it has its own particular challenges. The big housing debate will bring together leaders from politics, property, finance and academia, as well as people with lived experience to tackle the big questions and how they relate particularly to this part of the world. And what great timing, we're right in the middle of an election campaign, so what better opportunity to speak up, shine a light on the issue and present our leaders with some possible solutions. Now, some of you have sent in questions ahead of time and I will try to get to as many of those questions as possible during our panel sessions. And if your question doesn't get asked here, don't worry. All of the questions will be forwarded to the relevant speakers and politicians after the event. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. John Thane is the Deputy Mayor of Penrith. He's been a Penrith City Councillor since 1999 and has also served as Mayor for a number of years during that period. Councillor Thane is a strong advocate for people with disability, housing diversity and affordability. Please welcome to the stage John Thane.
Thank you, Auntie Carol, for that welcome to country. It's much appreciated. I also have problems with mics. Could I just acknowledge and thank our special guests for being here this morning as well. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Mayor Councillor Trish Hitchens, who sends her apologies today, but thank you for the opportunity to be part of the discussion today and to welcome you either in person or virtually in Penrith. I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts and insights from the keynote presenters today, along with the debate and discussion around social and affordable housing. There is much happening in Penrith right now, and our city is changing. We have a number of city-shaping projects that are realising our potential as the cities closest to the airport. However, at the same time, we are cognizant that we can't lose sight of those who are vulnerable and may be further adversely affected by the increased need for land and housing. I'm pleased to say that Penrith City Council's draft local housing strategy is currently on public exhibition till Tuesday, the 10th of May. Council's vision that is articulated in the draft local housing strategy is for a diverse range of housing forms to cater for a changing and growing population. Housing types will cater for different needs, demographics, and life cycle choices. Our vision is for housing choices that are underpinned by our affordability and environmental sustainability whilst being responsive to the local character of Penrith City. Neighbourhoods, new release areas and our rural villages. I would encourage everyone to view the plan and to provide feedback by going to your website, yoursay.com.au. Council believes that housing is a fundamental human right and one of our universal determinants of health and well-being. The concept of affordability is a relative issue. What is affordable for some is not affordable for others. We know from our own teams and the work that we do through social connection projects such as Neighbourhood Renewal and the Village Cafe that many of our residents who live in social housing and in the private rental market are doing things really tough. Affordability of housing can come at the cost of fresh food or basic choices about whether you can afford to send your children on school excursions. Ensuring that affordable rental housing and social housing is delivered to meet the needs of the very low and moderate income households is essential to enhancing the social sustainability of Penrith. Not only Penrith, but in Western Sydney as it grows and it changes. As a community, we understand that we can only thrive when all have access to safe and affordable housing. As I close this morning, I want to reiterate the opportunities are there for all levels of government, plus private and community enterprises, to work together in shaping the future of social and affordable housing across Western Sydney, and in Penrith, we're happy to be a partner. Thank you again for your invitation to speak, and congratulations to Western Sydney Community Forum and Link Wentworth Housing for organising and driving these really important conversations. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, John. Thanks for reminding us, as John said, housing is a fundamental human right and essential to all aspects of our well-being. Good to be reminded of that at the start of this event. You know, in the news business, we get so many different facts and figures thrown at us, and only a very tiny percentage of those cut through, as they say, and become part of the public narrative. One of those rare facts that has cut through, and I'm sure everybody here already knows it, is that the fastest growing demographic of people facing homelessness is women over the age of 55. Many of them have spent their lives working and raising families. Then, through a combination of life events that could happen to any of us, losing their job, divorce, single motherhood, illness, they end up with nowhere to live. My own mum was one of those older women. She spent many years on various public housing waiting lists while living with her adult children in different states. And finally, about 10 years ago, she was offered a small studio apartment in a new complex funded by a public-private partnership in Brisbane. She's now 95, nearly 96, still living independently and happily in her own home. She has a community of older people around her. She lives just above the doctor's surgery. The bus stop is there. IGA's, 5 minutes toddle down the road. She pays a modest percentage of her aged pension in rent, and she's there for as long as she is able to be. So I have seen firsthand the life-changing outcomes that can result from government and private involvement in social housing. Our next speaker is a Link Wentworth resident who has generously agreed to share her personal experience of finding safe and secure housing as a single older woman. Please welcome Mary. Come on up, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also would like to mention the people of Ukraine and their plight to live in freedom. As well, I want to acknowledge the people in Australia whose homes have been affected by floods, some not just once, but twice or 3 times. I apologise for my emotions. I don't live in the street, I live in my house. After my youngest son was born, I found myself as a single mother with 2 boys, 8.5 and 12 weeks old. It happened without any warning. I was living in Newcastle. The journey for me and my 2 boys was not easy. I moved to the Hawkesbury due to a short reconciliation with my ex-husband, but it fell apart and I found myself and my 2 boys needing a roof over our heads. I then applied for housing, feeling afraid and enormously concerned. I felt like a failure as a mum and as a person. It was not easy when I applied for housing. I wanted to live closer to my family in Bankstown, but I was told it was a 9-year wait. Hawkesbury was shorter, so I chose the Hawkesbury, as we needed a roof over our heads. I waited 12 months for a house, paying private rent, which was 60% of my income. Somehow, with the help of my parents, I could feed my sons. I then moved to a place in North Richmond, where I was for 9 years before my eldest son passed away on the 30th of August 1999. The street became unsafe for my youngest son. I applied for a transfer and was offered a new house in a very unsafe street with drugs and violence a common occurrence. I was offered another place, which I had to accept, otherwise I would continue to wait, and my son needed to be safe. I was given the keys and moved on the 8th of August 2000. I only had 4 days to move. When I moved to this new place, where I still live now, I very soon learnt this street was also unsafe for my son, and I felt unsafe too. I had to be extremely careful with how I related to my neighbours because I felt they didn't accept me. However, I could not be too fussy. We had a roof over our heads, and I had to make the best of it. Being able to pay my rent meant I had stability, and having stability allowed me to volunteer with the Women's Cottage in Richmond and also volunteer at my son's school. This gave me purpose. I was soon in a position where I could take on paid work. So I got a part-time job as a seamstress at the local dry cleaners within school hours. It worked out well because my son could get off the bus at the dry cleaners and we could go home together. So I could make sure he was safe. It hasn't always been easy, but I count myself as one of the lucky ones. I try to remain positive about my situation. As I reflect back, I now understand the decisions I made were based on the information I had at the time. It would be good to see more housing available for people who are on benefits or low income. It would also be good to see a variety of housing in all different parts of Sydney. It was disappointing to have to live as far from my parents, where they couldn't easily help with caring for my children. Without support, it made it difficult to work. The private rental market was and is too high. I understand landlords and companies want to make a profit, but sometimes this is just greed. Some houses are not fit for renting. I think of the word sharing. Landlords could still make a profit if they put aside a percentage to contribute to social and affordable housing. It reminds me when I was younger that when you start working, you put aside 5 or 10% of your income for a rainy day. This adds up over time. Could this be looked at by governments, developers and landlords? At present, we are witnessing huge unsustainable price increases. Wages are not increasing. A bag of corn has gone up by 50 cents in the last week. A bag of dog food has gone up twice in the last 3 weeks, from $7 to $8 to $9.50. How can we keep up? For me, the word sharing means we care for one another. By sharing, we can build homes where people feel they are valued, which means they feel safe and are happy to share their time and expertise. By sharing, we are giving each other a go. Sharing information allows for safety and transparency, better communication and consistency of information with the whole community, which could be easier to sustain. We all have skills which we can share and each learn, so our society can continue to grow forward. Sharing is caring. My goal as a teenager was to own my own home. I have not fulfilled my goal, but I am grateful for the roof over my head. I do not live in the street. I live in my house. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how much courage it takes to stand up in front of a massive room like this when you're not used to public speaking and share a really emotional and personal story. And I could see how difficult that was for Mary, especially in the start. She got the wobbles a bit. She had the wobbles all the way through. No, it was a really powerful story, and actually I think that's going to be one of the best things about a forum like this is to hear people and their personal stories, because that is what connects us as humans and that's what gets the message through. So thank you again, Mary. Okay, our next speaker, hard act to follow, but here we go. Our next speaker is Shane Mallard, a member of the New South Wales Legislative Council and also the Parliamentary Secretary for Western Sydney. Please welcome Shane Mallard to the stage.
Well, thank you for that, Manita. Thank you very much. And Mary, thank you for sharing that very personal story. It's a great way to really set the tone for the discussion today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join you today among such important, for want of a better word, industry stakeholders and leaders in this area. But before I do, I also want to join Auntie Carol Cooper and acknowledging country, the traditional custodians of the land of which we are meeting today here in Penrith, which is the Darug people, and of those lands where people are situated who are viewing over the internet, and their people as well, and their elders past and present. I join with Juanita in acknowledging the list of dignitaries, but everyone here is equally important at this forum, and acknowledge my parliamentary colleague, Honourable Rose Jackson, and other parliamentary colleagues who may be present. As a Parliamentary Secretary for Western Sydney, and I'm here today representing the government and particularly the local member, Minister Stuart Ayres, meeting the region's social and affordable housing challenges is an issue very close to my heart, in fact. I myself was born just over here at Nepean Hospital in the 60s, so older than I look, lucky like that. I was born on my mother's 17th birthday. My dad was 19. Now that's way too young to be a parent, I hope they're not watching, and way too young to enter the private housing market. And after a short stint at relatives when I came home, we moved into public housing, or housing commission, as we used to call it fondly, in Dunmore Street, Penrith, which is just up the road here, into a big 4-bedroom, vibro green housing commission house. And we spent roughly the first 10 years of my life there with, along came my sister and brother and another sister, and my young family was there. And I acknowledge that stable beginning for my very young family, my very young parents, who worked very hard to provide a roof over our head and move on from public housing to rental and ultimately to home ownership in Kingswood. I think that stability of my childhood and is one of the reasons why I'm here today, that I'm a Member of Parliament and represent the community in New South Wales, that I had the right chance in my family to start with. So I acknowledge how important for a family and for people, young people, as we talked about, is stable housing in your life. Now, I acknowledge that not everyone can be like my parents, who, whilst I will add had no money in my family, managed to make the break from, or move on from public housing through to the rental and home ownership market. Public housing has a very important role to play in providing short-term and long-term housing for people in our society, particularly in Western Sydney. I'm grateful today to Link Wentworth and to the Western Sydney Community Forum for bringing us together to debate the possibility to possibly one of the biggest challenges facing our society today of affordable housing. Now, the problem facing policymakers, how to address the growing need for more social and affordable housing, was already tough for governments of all persuasions. Let's not pretend it's just this government, of all persuasions. And in recent times, we've found ourselves with new external factors to consider, quite recent times. The impacts of climate change on the patterns of land use, and we've seen the flooding. And I live now in the Blue Mountains. We've seen the fires and the constraints of land use and land releases in the floodplains and indeed in the fire areas. We're well aware, hear the drums beating of interest rate increases, which will apply pressure on housing owners and access to housing and finance for some people. We're seeing the private rental market in Sydney, frankly, going through the roof. And it's increasing at the fastest rate in more than a decade. And we're seeing regional rents rise, not just because of the devastation of housing, as we heard in the north of New South Wales, but also as more people work from home because of COVID, and that may be a permanent structural change in our workforce, but also because people, and we're seeing this in the Blue Mountains, have left Sydney to go to regional rural areas during the COVID period. We're seeing reduced vacancy rates statewide, and the past 2 years of COVID have added significant pressure to the social housing waiting list, with households in priority need of safe housing growing by 29% over the last 2 years. All these additional external factors serve only to add additional pressure to the demand for social and affordable housing in Sydney and in regional New South Wales. So there's a significant challenge for policymakers, for government and frankly for society to address. Now the New South Wales Government, through the Land and Housing Corporation, and I'll be using some acronyms but I'm sure you all know them, LAHC, and the Aboriginal Housing Office, AHO, and the Department of Communities and Justice is on the front line in this challenge. Guided by the Housing 2041, the New South Wales Housing Strategy, which is available if you Google on the website, Land and Housing Corporation and the Aboriginal Housing Office are helping to deliver on that 20-year vision for housing. We have the largest social housing infrastructure portfolio in Australia. New South Wales has the largest social housing infrastructure portfolio. The LAHC owns approximately 125,000 social housing dwellings worth more than $51 billion. And the AHO owns approximately 6,000 properties valued at more than $2 billion. In Western Sydney, the LAHC owns some 50,000 homes, and 17,000 of those homes are located in 30 housing estates in our region. Many of these estates and properties are frankly ageing and becoming unfit for purpose. They're built at a different time for a different purpose. And if you go to Doomore Street, that 4-bedroom green fibro house has been demolished and it's now townhouses which are still used for social housing. We know this because the social housing waitlist tells us there is a significant demand for more one-bedroom homes across Western Sydney. And as I suggested, we have an oversupply of older 3-bedroom homes in the region. And that's why the LAHC is innovating housing to change and grow the New South Wales social housing mix so it can better meet today's needs. We want more people and families to have access to new, better quality, modern homes that are more accessible, sustainable, very important, easier to manage and more cost-effective to maintain. And I'll come back to maintenance in a minute. We're seizing the opportunity to use our land, your land, more wisely to build more homes where they are needed, which better meet the needs of tenants. On the point of maintenance, it's an important one in the broader context of the public housing portfolio and the allocation of resources. Now, more than half, 54% of the social homes are aged 41 years or more. And by 2038, 2 out of 3 homes will be aged more than 60 years. Ageing assets, as anyone who has got a private home would know, are costly to maintain. The LAHCS's total maintenance costs rose by 36% in the last 10 years. That reflects the age of the properties, from around $370 million in 2012 for the year to around $517 million in the financial year 2021. And clearly that's money that could be better invested in providing new homes. In financial year 2021, an average of 1,750 maintenance requests are received every single day. 1,750, equating to around 640,000 maintenance requests per year. This is money better spent on new, good quality homes fit for purpose for people in need. Over the next 5 years, the LAHC is on track to deliver at least 3,200 new homes across New South Wales. Now, I know we're taking a deep breath, that's not enough, but that's the situation at the moment, 3,200 new homes. The number of social homes available in New South Wales compared to 9 years ago is 154,925, it's just under 155,000, and that's an increase of 10% from June 30, 2010, just before we were elected. My government was elected in 2011, to 30th of June 2019, so 10% increase in real terms of social housing. And as well as delivering new social housing, we're also helping to build communities, the broader issues of government, building the economy, building infrastructure, sustainable jobs in the region and around the state. But what does this look like in reality? Well, I'm pleased to let you know that the government is driving a $6.7 billion pipeline of housing construction projects on LAHC sites in Western Sydney. That's $6.7 billion. One of the latest projects delivered as part of the pipeline was a $16.9 million 40-home development in St Mary's, which supported 84 jobs during its construction. The St Mary's project is a great example of LAHC's long-term commitment to deliver more keys and doors and to utilise existing resources to deliver a better outcome. creating house, as I said, housing for people in need. The LAHC took a site in St Mary's which previously contained 3 ageing houses, old houses, and transformed it into a 44-unit modern apartment complex, increasing the number of dwellings on the site for people in need by more than 14-fold. The 5-storey building on Phillips Street features 23 one-bedroom and 21 two-bedroom units, responding to strong demand for those smaller dwellings. And that's not an isolated example. I've opened a few other ones in the Western region that have similar examples. The St Mary's project also reflects on our focus on partnerships with the community housing sector, and hence today's forum. The building will be managed by community housing provider Evolve Housing under a 20-year lease. LAHC has transferred more than 13,000 social housing properties to community housing partners over the past 5 years under social housing management transfer program, as well as offering longer-term leases for an additional 11,000 properties that community housing providers manage on behalf of the government. Longer leases give community housing providers greater certainty over their portfolio and their rental income, and frankly access to finance to develop their projects as well, allowing them to schedule maintenance, protect their assets and create opportunities to deliver more homes. And I will add, one of the important aspects of the community housing partnerships is the wraparound services that come with that private sector or not-for-profit community sector involvement, which I greatly admire, and I think big government has trouble delivering those services to wrap around whatever they may be needed by tenants of those houses. I think that the more nimble, focused approach of the community sector has been much better at delivering those needed services for those communities. So in conclusion, social housing represents 18% of the state's asset value, 18%. Equals second with roads, and transport follows that, which is valued at 31% of our state's assets. But it's not just bricks and mortar in terms of the spreadsheet. It's much more than that. We want everyone in New South Wales to have access to a safe place they can call home, as my parents did in the 1960s and 70s. That's why we continue to invest more in social housing compared to any other state or territory in Australia. From 2012 to 2021, it's the period of the current government, the number of social homes increased 8% in New South Wales, ahead of the national increase, which is the national over that period is 4%. And frankly, the other states are just now starting to invest in public housing to catch up. And in fact, New South Wales has invested $9.3 billion over the past 5 years, or 32% of the national investment in public housing, 32% of it. So there is no silver bullet, and I'm not here to say there is, and we all want us to do more and to try and cut the pie up to get to more people. That's what we're trying to do. It will take continued collaboration at all levels of government, including local government, and I acknowledge the Deputy Mayor's comments earlier today, and industry, and especially the community sector, for us to address the focus of today's big debate. The New South Wales Government will continue to be guided by our Housing 2041 strategy, our 20-year plan to create the right conditions for increased supply of market, affordable and social housing, the whole housing package, for all people in New South Wales. I look forward to hearing from the panellists today. I'll stay as long as I can and take back to the government the messages from today, and look forward to working with the stakeholders here today, as I have done over the last 10 years. And I thank you for your time this morning.
Shane, thanks so much for being here and for taking us through some of the policy challenges of this issue. And we really are living in extraordinary times. You mentioned climate change, rising interest rates, COVID, ageing social housing properties, really is a perfect storm of challenges for different levels of government to address. We're now going to hear from one of Shane's upper house colleagues, this time from the other side of politics. I'm sure she's got some comments to make about policy. Rose Jackson is Labor's Shadow Minister for Housing and Homelessness. And before I ask her to come up here, I just will note we do have a question for Rose at the end from the audience, which she'll be happy to address after her speech. So please welcome Rose Jackson.
Thanks so much, Juanita. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and echo Mike's comments that it's incredibly important that we do that whenever we're having a conversation about housing, because the continued unfinished business of reconciliation continues to be expressed in all of the ways in which First Nations people are disadvantaged in their engagement with the housing market. So that's a really important place for us to start. I'd also really like to thank Mary for coming along and sharing that story and echo Juanita's comments. You know, I mean, as a political leader, you sometimes think about what does it take to make change? What does it take to change minds? What does it take to change policy? Is it facts and figures? Well, you know, they help. They help, but, you know, they can be overwhelming. It can kind of be a cacophony of sort of figures and statistics at some point. Is it community leaders and political leaders, you know, standing up and saying nice words? Well, you know, I mean, that helps too. It's good to have decision makers as part of these kind of forums and in these conversations, obviously, but I actually think that the power of personal story is what changes minds and make change. So, Mary, I think you coming along today and sharing that story with us is an incredibly important contribution to the conversation we're having. So thank you so much for that contribution. It really was very moving and very important. Look, I appreciate the name of today's event is the Big Housing Debate, and so maybe it's a little bit of a controversial place to start, but in a way I want to start by something about which I don't think there should be any debate, something I don't think reasonable minds can differ on, and that is that the current housing market in New South Wales is a complete and utter failure. There should not be debate that the housing market in this state is systematically failing. The evidence is clear, and it's overwhelming that Western Sydney is at the epicentre of this. The crisis is driving massive inequality. I think this is a really important consequence to note right up front. We are living in an increasingly unequal state and city, between the cities and the regions, between Eastern and Western Sydney, between people doing well and reaping massive benefits from the current housing system, and for those people for whom a 15% rent rise is the difference between a roof over their head and homelessness. We're seeing increasing inequality between generations. Young people in Australia today are less likely to own a home than at any time since Federation. It is simply unfair what our current housing market is doing to younger people. The great Australian dream of owning a home that they saw their parents and their grandparents strive for and in many cases succeed is completely out of reach for so many young people today. And unequal societies are unstable and unsafe societies. It's not just that it's sort of morally unfair that we live in a society which is unequal, and that's obviously not a place that we want to live. It's actually really bad for all of us. Economic growth is lower in unequal societies. Crime is higher. Environmental outcomes are worse. Unequal societies are unstable and unsafe places to live. And if we think about why our society is becoming more unequal, housing is actually at the centre of that. Now, having said, you know, statistics and facts and figures can be a bit overwhelming, I do just want to mention a few because they're so compelling. The median house price in Sydney is $1.6 million. In Western Sydney, it's $1.4 million. In the second quarter of 2021, the cost of housing was increasing by $1,200 a day. That is how unequal it is, how hard it is to purchase a house. But of course, we know in this conversation that affordability is not just about the capacity to buy a house, it's much broader than that. Rent is also increasing at phenomenal rates. A third of households in Western Sydney are experiencing rental stress, and rents are projected to increase even more. I mean, many people may have seen the infamous Hinchinbrook example from earlier this year when a decent 4-bedroom house came onto the market. So many people flooded the open house, the police had to close the street. There were hundreds of people just trying to inspect a decent family home that came onto the rental market in Western Sydney. That's how serious the rental crisis is becoming in this state. Uhuru demonstrates that there is not a single local government area which is affordable to buy or rent for a 2-bedroom apartment for a key worker whose income is $50,000 to $60,000 per annum. I mean, those are people like childcare workers, people looking after our kids, aged care workers, people looking after our parents, people who work in distribution centres, key workers, essential workers. We know how important these people are. They can't live in our city. They cannot afford to buy a home or even rent a 2-bedroom apartment in our city. So we know that they're moving further and further away. They're commuting for longer hours. They're paying hundreds of dollars in tolls and petrol. They're stressed. They're looking after our kids, our elderly parents. They don't have time for their own families. And the cause of that stress is housing, is our failing housing market. The utter unaffordability of the private market is driving huge demand for social and affordable housing. We know that. Waitlists have spiked. Over 53,000 people on the social housing waiting list in New South Wales, almost 10,000 on the priority waiting list. Those are people at immediate risk of homelessness. The wait times have blown out. So I always say I don't even take those figures particularly seriously. I mean, they're a useful guide and we know they've gone up. But for a lot of people, they're in that massive cohort who are experiencing housing stress. They know they are struggling to afford their private rent. They contact the government. They say, I'd like to access social housing. And the government says, that's great. We'll come back to you in 10 years. 10 years is the waiting time in some areas. I mean, people just give up. They say, what's the point? I'm not going to bother. So we know that there are more people, even than those tens of thousands of people on the list, who would be eligible but are not even bothering to put their name down because the wait times are so massive. We've seen a 40% increase in homelessness because people cannot access social and affordable housing. This is not just about what I call the tip of the iceberg of homelessness, which is people sleeping rough on our streets, the more visible part. We all know that under the water there's the huge iceberg. Couch surfing, people living in cars, in tents, in caravans, overcrowded housing. Western Sydney is the epicentre of overcrowded housing in Australia as well. And that leads to poor health outcomes. It was no accident that one of the central places of the COVID outbreak during Delta late last year was Western Sydney, where overcrowded housing was driving poor health outcomes. These things are linked. So I don't think that there can be any debate that we are experiencing a housing crisis in this state and its consequences for society are significant. I suppose the big housing debate is, what do we do about it? What do we do to resolve these problems? And there are a lot of legitimate ideas and priorities. There isn't a silver bullet. I don't agree with Shane that the government's record of investment in social and affordable housing is at record levels. Shockingly, we can have a debate about that. I'd point to the fact that per capita investment in New South Wales has gone backwards in the last 5 years, and that social and affordable housing as a percentage of our total housing stock is at the lowest point it's ever been. I'd throw those statistics back at you, but we're not going to have a statistic debate off right now. We're going to try and have a conversation about moving forward. What do we do about it? And I agree with my colleague Shane Mallard, there's no silver bullet. What I do think, though, we need, the one thing that should guide our response is urgency. And I do feel as though there is a lack of urgency from the state and federal government. In the context of the federal election, because that is, in a way, the federal campaign is the moment that we're in right now, I think that the lack of a national housing affordability strategy is a glaring omission in our national debate right now. We need big dollars on the table from the federal government that requires states to actually deliver housing. We need broader national schemes that consider things like debt forgiveness for state housing agencies. We've seen that in Tasmania. Why can't other states access that? That might actually make a contribution to putting a meaningful dent in the maintenance backlog that Shane mentioned, but that we know is chronic. And I don't know about, I'm sure Link Wentworth, the number of complaints that I get about mould just after the recent rain that we've all been having is just through the roof. The maintenance backlog is phenomenal. We need the federal government to look at tax settings and tax policy changes, in particular those that might actually incentivise build to rent. We have not seen anywhere near the level of support for build to rent, which is a genuine affordable housing solution, and federal tax settings are part of the problem. We need to look at state planning policies. We need to look at state infrastructure policies. One of the things that I'd call for is a framework shift, where when we talk about state infrastructure investment, we're not just talking about roads and public transport. We actually see affordable housing as an infrastructure investment. When this government touts its record infrastructure spending, it's not talking about housing. Affordable housing isn't seen as infrastructure in that same way, and it should be. It should be seen as infrastructure investment. We need more investment in social housing maintenance, as I've mentioned. I think that's absolutely critical. I think we can use that as part of a contribution to greening our society. Why shouldn't we have solar on all of the rooftops of social housing? Why shouldn't we have double glazing? Why shouldn't we have better insulation? Some of you may be familiar with the University of Wollongong, which did research recently that showed that a phenomenal number of social housing residents were living in unsafe temperature conditions because the maintenance hadn't been done. Older people literally freezing during winter, living in unsafe temperatures because the social housing maintenance work had not been done on their properties. My colleague Jason Clare can't be here today, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention that federal Labor has put $10 billion on the table as part of its National Housing and Homelessness Plan and has committed to a National Housing and Homelessness Strategy. Those are two genuine, meaty, game-changing commitments from federal Labor that have the backing of everyone from the Property Council to the Master Builders, Shelter, Homelessness Australia. Those are big commitments to actually drive a conversation about housing into our national policy debate, and I think that that is incredibly important. I know that it's not possible for state and federal governments to click their fingers and fix the housing crisis. I am aware, even as an opposition MP that demands change, that isn't possible. But what I do demand is that they prioritise it, that it is central to their agenda, that they really dig deep with organisations like those present here today, the community housing providers, non-government organisations, private partners, with some real urgency to try and resolve these issues. And I do think that that urgency is lacking, and I think that's sad. And it's a real sadness because, like others have mentioned, housing is the bedrock issue. You know, as a Labor person and as everyone who's committed to fairness and social justice, it doesn't matter in a way what your politics is. If your values are fairness and social justice, you want people to be able to get a good education, you want them to be able to get a good job, you want them to be able to look after their health. Those are really basic shared concepts for all Australians. How can we do that if people don't have access to housing? Housing is the foundational issue for all of those other things. How can you finish school, finish a TAFE course, imagine getting to university if you don't have stable housing? How can you look after your health, your physical health, your mental health, your kids' health, if you're in unsafe and unstable housing? How can you get a job? How can you prepare for work every day? How can you commute to your job, find it, get to that interview, make it there on time if you're constantly couch surfing or you're living in a car? Without access to stable, safe and secure housing, all of our aspirations for the kind of fulfilling lives people could lead are undermined, fundamentally undermined, because that bedrock isn't there. Insecure and unstable housing is the key social justice issue for our time, and I am so pleased that Link Wentworth and the Western Sydney Community Forum have put on this event as an opportunity for us to have a conversation about how we resolve that issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Rose. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for a question, I'm afraid. But I think Rose has demonstrated the value of those facts and figures and statistics of painting a true picture of how dire the situation is. Well, one of the highlights of today's event is the launch of a research paper by Deloitte, which has been looking into Commonwealth policy on social and affordable housing. I'd like to introduce next Sevilla Boone. She's the Associate Director of Infrastructure and Capital Projects at Deloitte. Civi's going to be on our first panel, but first she's going to share with us the findings of this latest research. So please welcome Sevilla Boone.
Thank you, Juanita. Is this microphone okay?
It is, yes.
Okay. And I'll just press the clicker. Is that? Ah, brilliant. It wouldn't be, you know, COVID without some kind of technical difficulties. So I'm just going to press the clicker again. Oh, yep, here we go. Thank you. So before I start, I too would like to acknowledge the unique status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the original owners and custodians of lands and waters, including the lands and waters of Western Sydney. I agree, I think it's really important that we do that. I'd also like to thank all the distinguished guests who have come before me and who are present in the audience today. And I'd also like to thank the team who have been organising this event, including Brianna Regal, because I know it's a lot of work. And there have been a few COVID curveballs, no doubt, to make things tricky. Oh. So, on behalf of Deloitte, it gives me great pleasure to launch the Commonwealth Social and Affordability Policy Review paper. It was commissioned by the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue, along with the largest CHPs operating in the Western Sydney region, which you will see appearing on the screen. And this is one of the many social housing projects Deloitte has completed across the country. Our work spans the spectrum of housing, from strategy and policy advice to social housing transfers, procurement, tax and accounting advice, debt and project finance. We're lucky enough to rely upon a global network of experts so we can look at translating international solutions to the local context in Australia, noting that there are many differences. Some of you may know my colleagues in this space, including Theo Psychogis, Stephen Pollock, Anne Vivian, Sharon Nye, Sally Muir, Roger Muir, unrelated, Sasha Smith and Phil Davies. And my interest in social and affordable housing, like many of the speakers who've come before me, extends beyond the professional to the personal. So while I was at university, I actually lived in community housing. And if any of you have been to Canberra, you might know Havelock House in the ACT, which is where I lived at a time where my income and my housing options were severely constrained. So I too have benefited from community housing. And now as a parent, I'm acutely aware of the housing pressures upon young people, particularly in our largest metropolitan cities. I've got 3 kids, so they're growing up quickly, and I'm thinking, like a lot of my friends, about what the future will hold for them. And as a woman, I'm acutely aware that the fastest growing cohort experiencing homelessness are older women, which we'd heard about earlier on today. So this morning, I'm going to provide some brief highlights of the report that you can see on the screen before we have our panel discussion. And for your information, this report is available on the Link Wentworth website and on the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue website too. And I'd encourage you all to download it and read it. So, it's no surprise to anyone who's in the audience here today that the biggest issue facing the social housing sector is the large and growing gap between supply and demand. I had a whole bunch of statistics that I could have gone through, but I think between Rose and Shane and all the other speakers, you've covered it off for me. Luckily, the focus of this paper is on the Commonwealth, so you're both kind of out of the firing line. I think there was a bit of a discussion. I mean, Shane mentioned the fact that he grew up with his family in social housing, and a lot of the social housing was in fact designed for working families, but we know now that across the country that it's really changed, and the social housing cohort's becoming increasingly more vulnerable. There are more single parent households, single individuals who are there, and they often have complex and multidisciplinary needs. So it's a different picture, and that housing stock hasn't kept pace to reflect the needs of the new cohort. And I think it was already mentioned that a lot of that housing stock is aging and there's a maintenance backlog. So as I said before, the focus really of this report was on the Commonwealth's policy. And you can see here on this graphic of how the Commonwealth's role has changed over time from building supply to really influencing supply. It shifted away from being the major funder to influencing policies both of states and territories, and non-for-profit and private organisations to address affordability and drive supply. And the primary way that the Commonwealth Government has done this is through the current National State Housing Agreement, which I imagine a number of you are familiar with, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, and as well as other direct policy levers like Commonwealth Rental Assistance and the National Housing Financial Investment Corporation, NIFIC. And one of the panel members, Hugh, is here to represent NIFIC later on. The Commonwealth Government also plays a significant role through macroeconomic policy, tax policy and population policy. We heard earlier about inflationary pressures, which Australia is not the only country that's experiencing, but around the world that's really being felt by people. Onto the CHP sector. So, as I'm sure you all know, the CHP sector plays a substantial and important role in social and affordable housing, and that's an increasing role in the sector. Since 2012, the CHP sector has invested more than $1.2 billion in new housing supply across New South Wales. But the CHP sector is unable to make an impact without acknowledging and addressing the issues it faces, which include its ability to generate only marginal surpluses through operations to fund new properties because its primary source of income is CRA, Commonwealth Rental Assistance. Its access to other sources of funding, including institutional investment. Its access to affordable land in the right areas, so near job centres with supporting infrastructure. We heard about Juanita's mother earlier on, who was able to access social housing in an area, or public housing in an area that was, had a lot of helpful infrastructure around it, which is important. The CHP sector requires support from the Commonwealth to support and grow its portfolio, and a combination of policies and strategies is needed for the sector to be successful. So the report, which hopefully you'll all read as soon as you leave this event, lists a number of different policy levers and assesses them against some robust criteria. I think the take-home message is that you can't just have one kind of policy solution, you need a range of policy solutions, and that you really need to have strategic long-term planning and coordination across all levels of government, the private and not-for-profit sectors. So, it takes the whole sector to really make a difference here. You can see that the CHP sector, as I said before, needs support to access low-cost capital, low-cost land, and to grow its capacity. And any intervention must be sustainable, successfully generating more affordable and convenient housing opportunities for low to moderate income households, particularly in key locations. That's a message that keeps coming up. Policy levers should incentivise partnerships between government, CHPs and the private sector, support genuine coordination across all levels of government, as distinct from the national state housing agreements, incentivise institutional investments, such as accelerated depreciation and superannuation investment, and incentivise the private market. I think we heard before about build to rent. There is an ongoing role for NIFIC as well to support housing supply and increase CHP access to finance through the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator. So I haven't touched on all the findings of the report. It goes into a lot of depth, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that during the panel discussion at any other time. But I would like to say in closing that it's really my strong belief, both as a person who's lived in community housing and as a parent, and as a woman, as a citizen and as a Deloitte employee, that investment in social and affordable housing is important if we are to ensure the benefits of future economic growth are shared among the many rather than just among the few. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Sivi. Before you get too comfortable, we're going to be moving straight onto our panel, which you're a part of. So if you'd like to go and take a seat, and I will go over there as well and start introducing the rest of our panel, and we'll get that underway. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, excellent technology. Thank you. Okay, so we're just about to start our first panel for the day, and I will ask everyone, the rest of the panel members, to start making their way over here. The topic for the panel is making the economic and social case for investment in social and affordable housing. I'm going to introduce you all now to our audience, so if you could just give them a nice big wave when I say your name, in case they haven't met you yet. Now, Sevilla Boone, who you already know, who's just given us the address. Hugh Hardican. Hi, Hugh. Thanks for being here. Senior Advisor for the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. Hugh has more than 15 years of public policy experience working in government, including 7 years at the Australian Treasury. Ryan Banting. Hi, Ryan. Good morning. Director of Social Infrastructure at Australian Unity. In that role, Ryan is responsible for managing Australian Unity's investments across the social infrastructure sectors. That includes specialist disability accommodation, student accommodation, childcare, seniors living and long stay accommodation options such as build to rent and key worker housing. Billy Sankovic. Hey, hi Billy. CEO of the Western Sydney Community Forum, which shapes social policy and service delivery across the region. Billy has extensive leadership experience in community development, service delivery and social policy and planning. But as she said to me at the start of the day, I'm in social work, I'm all about the people. So she's all about the people. Thanks for being here, Billy. Leo Patterson-Ross. Hey, Leo. Leo is the CEO of the Tenants Union of New South Wales. Leo's worked in housing justice and community development for 15 years after initially training in social work. So he spent more than a decade at the Tenants Union helping renters and the public understand and navigate the housing system. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to just open the panel and please feel free to jump in with your microphones. We've heard some pretty sort of dire statistics, terrible facts and figures. We know a lot of the challenges. If we keep going the way we are in terms of social and affordable housing, I mean, what sort of a society are we going to end up in? What are the impacts going to be on people? Anyone want to jump in there? Go for it, Billy.
I'm the social worker, so I love going first. And I got stuck with this seat, so I deserve to go first. I think, Juanita, we're already seeing it, and I just want to thank Auntie Carol and Mary and Shane and Rose as well. We heard it this morning. We're already seeing it. The data is clear. The stories are clear. We have known for a long time that we have increasing social polarisation. The evidence tells us that not only is there increasing levels of disadvantage across all indicators, but also a growing gap. So, there's in terms of the Sydney context, there's a disproportionate impact on the people that live in Western Sydney. The data's there, the evidence is there, we're already living it, and housing is fundamental, it's central and primary to health and wellbeing. So, and we're seeing it in terms of the indicators, in terms of employment, in terms of health indicators, in terms of safety indicators. So they're all there. We're already seeing it.
Yeah, I think that, what Rose was saying, she basically summed it up as growing inequality, and I guess the less affordable housing we have, the greater the inequality, and that's what we're going to be seeing. Sevia, I just want to throw this question to you. I think it was, yes, we heard earlier about the ageing social housing stock. And the maintenance problems, and somebody mentioned the mould as well. How does this need to be addressed when we're developing a long-term strategy for social and affordable housing?
How do we address maintenance?
The changing housing needs of Greater Western Sydney, taking into account the ageing stock.
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally there should be some sort of asset recycling program, and that makes sense. And to be fair to Western Sydney and New South Wales, these are not problems that are only experienced in this area, they're national problems. So I've been doing some work in South Australia, and it's the same issue. You're seeing a more vulnerable change tenant cohort with specific needs. You've got housing stock that really was built for working families in the past. The housing stock is aged, it's got high maintenance costs, which are just associated with ageing properties. So that there are lots of really good models that are available. So for example, where you sell off land and you redevelop, it might be a mixed use development where you get a mixture of, say, commercial, affordable rent and social housing, and you can use that to subsidise the social housing. There's lots of different options around, but I think fundamentally that's the kind of way to go.
Okay. Hugh Hartigan, let's talk about supply and demand. That seems to be the big thing that's coming up a lot. So is it just a question of opening up more land for housing?
Yeah, look, land is fundamental to housing. I think that goes without saying. And I think, we released our State of the Nation's housing report at NIFIC sort of about a month ago. And essentially what that piece of work does, it essentially maps supply and anticipated new household formation across the country, across major cities and regional areas. And essentially what we're trying to kind of map there is any kind of differential, any looming construction gaps, etc. And that's for the private market. I think where this is really relevant to the discussion today is, and I think probably one of the points I'd like to make, is that the housing market is really, it operates like a housing system, right? So anything that's going wrong in the broader housing market is actually going to influence and put a lot of pressure down at the bottom end. So if we're going to have construction shortfalls across major cities and regional areas in the private market sector, we're going to have even more pressure, more housing stress, higher rents, and more people getting pushed onto waiting lists. So look, land's definitely one of the issues. I think one of the things we've spoken about, and a really important piece of research, I think, and we've got a Landcom representative here on the next panel, you might want to ask her, is, understanding where the land is and how it can be used. And I'll leave that to my Landcom colleague maybe to talk about what they're doing in that space.
Right, okay. Leo, I want to bring you in at this point too, because, we obviously know there is a huge rental crisis, and every time housing values go up, that makes it even worse. Housing stress is currently defined as paying more than 30% of your income on rent. And every time I hear that statistic, I think, who pays only 30% of their income on rent? And I think it was Mary who mentioned that when she got into social housing, it was 60% of her income, and she had to get support from her family to help with that.
Can I just jump in there? But it's also if you're in the bottom 40% quintile of income earners.
That's right.
And that's the point, yeah.
Yes, that's the group that's most affected. So Leo, do you think we're going far enough to address rental affordability using those measures?
So, we've really built that 30-40 rule, that 30% of rent, 40% lowest incomes, into a lot of housing policy when it's really designed to be just a rule of thumb. It's not supposed to be a hard and fast rule, but it's the rule that real estate agents use to test a rental application. It's how public housing and community housing rents are set now, and it actually is really inappropriate. The much better method would be to look at what resources the household has after they've paid for their housing costs, to say, if you've paid your rent, what do you have left? Do you have enough for food? Do you have enough for healthcare? Do you have enough for education? Do you have enough for all of these really important aspects of life? And the answer in public and community housing, as much as in the private sector, is no. People don't have enough. We ran as a state, we ran a natural experiment over COVID where the job seeker rate was increased, it was doubled during COVID. And public and community housing rents didn't increase to capture that increased rent. And so for people on job seeker, they ended up with a rate of rent being about 12.5% of their income rather than the usual 25%. And what happened was rent arrears dropped dramatically. People could afford all the basics in their life. And people often forget that actually in public housing in the 70s, 60s, the rent was not set at 25% then, it was set at 18%. And it made things a lot easier for people to actually experience social and affordable housing as that basis to recover from traumatic lives and move on and stay in their housing. I think the other aspect here is we are too quick to move people on from the only really stable form of rental housing in our state. We've chosen, it's a choice, not a natural inclination, we've chosen to make private renting very unstable. The average tenure is 18 months for private renters. The Uni of Adelaide recently released some data, through some more facts and figures, released some research showing that you need to have a stable rental home for at least 6 years to have the same mental health outcomes as owner-occupiers. We don't give people that, and we choose not to give it. We could easily change it. It's a very simple fix. So when we talk about what's affordable, what's stress, we've got to look at the numbers, with the finances, but we've also got to look at what the actual impact on people's lives is, what the experience of renting in the private market as much as in social and affordable housing, because in the private market, many people who as we talked about, there's 50,000 people on the waiting list, there's tens of thousands more who would love to be on the waiting list. they are not experiencing the stability and the security of public and community housing.
Okay. Absolutely, John.
I think that's a really crucial point, and I think it came through Mary's dialogue today. It's not just about affordability, it's about stability. If we don't get a more secure tenure situation in the rental market, essentially what we have is a social and affordable housing system where people aren't moving through it. They don't want to leave it, and it's perfectly natural not to want to leave a tenure where you're moving into a very, very unstable and unpredictable environment, particularly at the lower end of the rental market. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's get on to the involvement of private industry then. I guess we all acknowledge that this is such a huge issue. Governments cannot deal with it on their own. We need the involvement of the private sector. Ryan Banting, you're in social infrastructure at Australian Unity. What are the benefits for private industry in investing in this sector?
So I think, sorry, I'm not sure if this is on. I think we look at it in probably a number of different ways. The first way that's really meaningful for Australian Unity is to look at how it enables communities to interact and communities to work together and develop. And I think there are a lot of people doing a lot of work on accommodation as a challenge for the nation. And Juanita, you're right. I don't think it can only be government, whether it's local, state or federal, that works to solve the solution, because it's a $290 billion solution. Chris Leptos at NIFIC has done a lot of work that identifies and tries to capture the scale of what we're facing into. When you look at the number of people that are looking for accommodation today that we're not building for, when you look at the rate of population growth, that means we need to have accommodation for those people built. We simply can't do that with the same approaches that we've used. We think that there needs to be a novel solution, and it needs to involve industry, because that will lead to instability in workforce. And we're already seeing how that plays out today after 2 years of very little immigration and a lower birth rate through COVID. So imagine in 5 or 10 years' time, when there isn't the housing stock available for people to establish themselves and participate in the economy, we start to get this yawning gap in terms of businesses that need skilled labour but can't get it because the labour force for that skilled, for those skilled jobs, just they can't either live or reside near where they need to work or even have the stability to maintain a job. So I think business, number one, we look at it from a workforce stability perspective. Now, our specific perspective on that is a cohort that has been discussed today, vulnerable women, that represent the care workforce. And when you look at those, that cohort of workers that earn roughly $20 an hour and work in some of our most high trust environments, caring for older, aged people who are in their last phases of life, for them to be unable to afford some form of accommodation is a travesty. And so we look at it from a workforce security perspective as well as a community perspective. And then there's an economic view. So I think, if business isn't involved in the dialogue, if business isn't involved in the solution, and if we don't look at novel solutions, I don't think we're actually going to solve the problem.
Okay.
Could I just quickly add, we talk a lot about business and we mean like the big corporations, but we've also got to acknowledge that most landlords in the private market own 1 or 2 properties. And we actually probably need a much better conversation about the social contract around what private investors are doing in the private rental sector. What do they think they're providing? What kind of obligations to the broader community do they have in providing the really essential service of housing? At the moment, it's really absent from the conversation. It's important to bring institutional, but you can hear from the room that there's a lot of frustration.
I think that's really right, because we talk about build to rent as a novel sector, but build to rent is not novel at all. We've had a tax policy that has encouraged the construction of houses and the reaping of negative gearing benefits for mum and dad investors. potentially people in this room. We need to think about how we can utilise the private sector, business and individuals, to help bridge that gap and that social contract, which is so important.
Can I just bring in Hugh at this point, because he's been a little bit quiet, and I want to ask you, Hugh, what are investors telling you that they want to see that might attract them to invest in the market?
Yeah, look, that's interesting. Look, I think we need to be clear-eyed about this. I think the private sector brings amazing dynamism and innovation, and I think that absolutely they're going to be a big part of this solution in terms of addressing the $290 billion investment. It's a really, really big challenge. It'll be a partnership. We need to be a bit clear-eyed about the funding gaps. Despite sort of mixed tenure and a whole lot of innovation that go into some of these financing arrangements, we do still have funding gaps. So that essentially means the revenue in some of these housing projects, particularly at the social end, are simply not nearly enough to cover the building costs. So that's something, but we also kind of need to accept that governments are constrained. I don't see any level of government throwing billions and billions and billions of dollars at this over the next few years, just given how constrained budgets are. But interestingly, just on the investor point, I think this is a really, really interesting point. We've been out there consulting with a lot of investors, and what they're telling us is they actually want to hear more about stories that Mary told today. And I found that really interesting. So they're not sort of, necessarily asking for money or, that kind of stuff. What their clients are going to their funds and asking them for is they want to know exactly where their dollars are going, who it's helping, where they're putting a roof over someone's head, and what it's actually doing to their lives in a meaningful way in terms of well-being, anxiety, but even broader things like educational attainment. Mary mentioned it today. When she got that stability of tenure, what did she go? She went out and volunteered, and she got a job, and she participated in the economy. And I think if we can better tell that story, I think we're going to get more interest from the investment community. The ESG space is ballooning at the moment, and I think that's a really, really kind of big opportunity for us.
Okay, Billy, you wanted to say something? Oh, sorry, Civi.
Yeah, I think everybody wants to say something. Maybe that's why we're on the panel. But just in terms of the kind of the finance side of things and the private investment, I think some of the feedback that we've got, because we do things with ground lease models and build to rent as well, is that it's good to have long-term stability for investors so that they're not exposed to refinancing risk. So, a 10-year time frame is not long enough. You really need 30 years. And at the moment, there's an inflationary pressure, so we don't know where interest rates are going, but we think they're going to go up. And there's also a construction risk costs are rising as well. So it's really a long-term perspective that needs to be taken. And that's both from the investment side of things, but also from the tenancy side of things. We talked about the mum and dad investors who comprise most of the landlords in Australia. In other countries, that's not how it works, and you have kind of institutional investors, and you have an assumption that you might be renting for the long term, and we haven't had that in Australia, but I think that needs to change, and that's a fundamental shift in the way that we think.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very different here from say, Europe or even the United States, parts of the US, where people do expect to be renting for life. It doesn't really happen here, and I'm sure we've all heard many, many stories of friends who've moved into a rental property. They live there for 6 to 12 months, the property market goes berserk, and before they know it, the owner of the property has said, well, sorry, we're kicking you out, we're going to sell it because we're going to make $1 million profit. And does seem to be quite peculiar to the Australian property market, would you suggest?
I mean, this is slightly off topic, but even in places like Germany, where after World War II they decided that a lot of the population would rent, the approach that tenants take is very different. So for example, you bring your own kitchen, as a tenant, and that's a very different perspective, isn't it, to what we would think here in Australia. So I think there's some big conversations we need to have about what the future looks like and whether that's owning property or renting, and how we can encourage participation of everyone in society, to the point that Ryan made earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Leo, do you look at the examples overseas and go, yeah, actually that country's got it right, or that country's got it right?
Yeah. I don't think any country's got it perfectly right. I think there's lots of good lessons we can take from a whole range of countries. So I think that Europe is often pointed to, because they did go through this national trauma, and they looked at how they can recover, and they did prioritise communities, they prioritised stability of those communities, and that's really the key difference. And actually, the stats aren't so different. The amount of small holdings landlords, is not actually that far out. In Sweden, for instance, it's very similar profile to Australia. In Germany, it's really not too different. What's different is the attitude and the kind of joint community conversation about, do we have a housing sector whose priority is housing people and investment is a mechanism to make that happen? Or do we have an investment strategy where housing is sort of a bonus if it happens to arise? And unfortunately, I think we've got the second at the moment. We really need to shift to the first. And that would change a whole lot of decisions, because once you say, well, here's the outcome we want, what are the steps we need to take to achieve that, you start putting in place policies that are in aid of that. And that's why it's so important to have things like national housing strategies that really clearly spell out, this is what we're trying to achieve, this is the reason we're trying to achieve it, and the reason we should be trying to achieve it is to make sure that people in Australia have a home to live in.
Okay, Billy, did you want to say something?
Yes. Look, I actually was just wanting to really reiterate that point, Leo, so well said. And what came to my mind when we were discussing this was bananas. So who knows about housing and bananas? So I want to tell you about that, because I think that talk speaks to exactly your point. And when we talk about private investment, it's absolutely critical that we're working together and looking at leveraging private investment to be able to provide people with somewhere to live, because fundamentally that's what it's about. But Professor Peter Phibbs and Professor Nicole Woodrow, who are, our prominent thought leaders in Australia for several decades around housing, say that housing's not just, it's not like bananas. And it's not like bananas because bananas, when the price increases when there's lots of bananas, the bananas are cheaper. And when there's not many bananas, bananas are more expensive. So obviously it's a supply issue. And this is pretty straightforward stuff. But it talks to your point, Leo, in terms of how we frame why we do what we do. And what we've seen is that it's not just a supply issue, because in the context of bananas, there are several reasons for that, but in the context of bananas, bananas, I'm gonna not get this out right, but it's an important point in that bananas, when there's more bananas, there's less consumption. It doesn't matter. Some people choose not to buy bananas at that point in time, when they're expensive rather. But when house prices are increasing, there is more demand and increasing demand. We all know that because everyone needs somewhere to live, and everybody, goes to those open houses when prices are increasing. But the fundamental point there is that when we have this combined effort to provide housing, and when there is considerations of private investment, it must be led by the principle of housing being a fundamental right, and the primary purpose of housing being to provide a home. And the sessions that I'm involved in for several years have always been a private investment has always been a supply-focused, market-led solution. And until we're clear about our framework, and until we're clear that there must be public investment, there must be. Other countries are doing it, and we all live in these constraints, but it's a choice not to put public investment into social and affordable housing. We won't be able to move out of the situation we're in now unless we have this sort of beyond supply-focused private investment approach.
Thanks for that, Billy. Well, I'm going to go to a question from the audience first, unless you want to have a quick word, Leo.
All right, well, since we've paused, I'm just going to make very quickly the point. So looking at the international experience, what I tend to see is that countries make a choice between sort of two routes. They either regulate more heavily their rental sector to achieve the outcomes, or the government is involved in intervening. So it actually competes in the market. It provides that competition to particularly the lower end of the private rental market, in order to say, there is a better way, and now you have to compete with us because your customer tenant actually has an option. And that's what we're really missing here, is people at the lower end of the rental market, the private rental market, don't have a viable, genuinely affordable alternative. And so that's where the consumer dynamic just completely falls apart, even though that's how we've constructed a lot of our laws. Governments make a choice between intervening in the market directly by being a player, or by regulating it. In Australia, we've generally done neither, particularly over the last 40 years, and that's why we're increasingly becoming so difficult to deal with.
Okay, thanks, Leo. Now, do we have Michael Bolton here from Link Wentworth Tenant Advisory Group? If Michael's here, just... oh, great, right down the front. Thanks, Michael. You have a question for our panel, and I think we're going to be directing it to Sevilla Boone first, but go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you all for trying to decipher some of the huge problems that there are in the housing affordability market. It seems to me wage growth in the past few years has been capped at around a rate of about 2.5%, while rental payments have been steadily increasing towards something close to 9% in the same period. Clearly, many renters in that circumstance face extreme financial stress, but current housing policies, both state and federal, seem to be delivered solely to benefit home ownership and investors, and not really renters. Is it now time to perhaps revisit former schemes where you raise the bar and the platform to federal intervention? And I'm thinking of the Rudd government's National Housing Affordability Scheme. That did seem to deliver sustained increases for a period of time in funding, and there was certainly housing growth and investment in affordable housing in that period.
Thanks for that, Michael. Sivi, do you want to take this first? Did this come up in the Deloitte review, past policies?
Yes, so that's actually what, I mean, thank you for your question, Michael. I think it's a really good question, and the specific initiative that you're talking about was reviewed in our report, and you can read that in detail. So that, I think that ended in about 2015, and though there were people who thought it was really good, there were critics too that it didn't have a long enough time frame. I mean, I think you touch on the fact that we have seen this big increase in rents, and one of the things that I imagine you're familiar with is the Commonwealth Rent Assistance and the findings of the Henry Review in 2008, which talked about increasing that. I mean, and that's, you know, Ahuri's commented on that too. That's nothing that people aren't aware of, really. That hasn't really kept pace. So I think it's a good point, and we are facing incredible inflationary pressures at the moment too. So I mean, I think fundamentally, there's not just one policy solution, though. You'd have to look at a whole bunch of them. Other things that might be useful are things like the city deals, where which could be applied to Western Sydney, for example, where you try and have a percentage of social and affordable housing targets for the region. So I think it's a really good point. I think there's probably a whole range of things that could be done. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Well, I'm going to direct it also to Hugh. As Michael pointed out, government policies seem to favour much more home ownership rather than being interested in making rental more affordable. How does that affect the preference for home ownership versus longer-term rentals?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been covered quite a bit on the panel already, but look, there's a whole range of reasons why people want to own a home, right? It's not just a service, it's not just putting a roof over someone's head, but it'll discuss this as well. It's a financial asset. Housing typically will form a big part of household savings over a lifetime, and people generally know if they can get in and service a mortgage, they're going to be better off at retirement. But I think that there's also the more important thing that I think's been discussed today, which is it provides stability. In the rental market, we simply don't get the stability that we do in some of the other countries we've spoken about. And I think that if we had a more stable rental market, there might be kind of a different sort of preference, through that, in terms of home ownership versus renting. But certainly at the moment, I think that most people would want to own a home purely for that stability. And again, thanks, Mary, for that story. But I think that was, a real catalyst, that stability point for what it did, to your life and how you were able to go out and participate.
Okay, am I getting the wind up now? One more little, well, I'll just, because Michael's question was really good, and I know there have been all sorts of different schemes with different governments over the years, and some of them have been really successful. Would anybody else like to jump in and just address Michael's question before we have to wrap it up?
Sorry, I don't want to jump on Billy's been missing out, so I was checking that she...
I do have something to say.
Yeah.
Right, I'm sure she will have her say.
So I think one of the key points, not to reiterate what I already said, but we talk about home ownership, and I think that confuses how homes are created. So I really actually have an objection to home ownership, because you don't buy a home, you make a home. And rental are just as much homes as owner-occupied. They should be seen as such. And that makes a big difference to government's priorities. Where if we continue to say that you own a home, but rent a house or a unit, it makes this big difference to the way we think of things. So we need to shift that. Just specifically on the NRAS, on the National Rental Affordability Scheme, affordable housing, has a part to play here. But I think we've got to be very cautious about what that role is. There's 2 points I'd like to make. One is that in relation to rents outstripping wages, affordable housing is generally structured. There's one notable exception, which is City West housing in the city, but affordable housing structured as a reduction of the market rent. And so if the market rent rises too fast, that subsidy, that 20%, 25% drop from the market rent is just not enough. And we have seen properties where the eligibility band of people who earn enough to be able to afford the place, but not so much that they're too high eligibility, gets so narrow that we really wonder how anyone's getting housed. Like it's such a narrow band. What affordable housing does, and we've alluded to this, is that it's part of a sort of cross-subsidy particularly within community housing portfolios. The reason that that's important is because the rents from the from either public or community housing aren't enough to cover the full operational costs and the capital costs. But I just do want to pick up, Sevilla, on one thing, which is that the primary funding source for public and community housing is, and particularly for community housing, it's not CRA, it's actually the rents paid by the renters in those homes. And for every dollar that government actually puts into public housing, tenants pay 5. The gap between what is actually needed to operate a social housing home and the rent received is not very much. Our problem is we made a choice. It wasn't by accident. The demographics didn't change by accident in the 70s and 80s. We made a choice to restrict the eligibility and change that profile. And the consequence of that was that the public housing providers and community housing providers have less and less income to run their business from. If we address that by allowing people to stay in their stable home and earn more money, still prioritising people in greatest need coming in, but letting people earn more while staying in the property, while not putting their housing at risk, we'd actually see a much more sustainable housing system, a public and community housing system, because the rent would actually cover the operational costs. And then things like CRA, government funding, it can be aimed at capital growth, building more properties, rather than trying to rely on the poorest people in Australia funding the housing for other poorest people and everyone else kind of sitting back and just putting in the little top-ups.
We're going to have to wrap up the panel now, I'm sorry, but I'm going to give the final word to Billy because I know she's busting to say something. So, Billy, keep it short. What would your final comments be as we wrap up the panel?
I guess I'd just like to say that there has been talk about wraparound services and how critical they are, and to your point about renting, there are some excellent local level examples where tenants have been able to be supported, particularly to stay in private rentals and have that stability that's so important when we're talking about a home for people.
Thank you so much for that. We are going to have to move on fairly quickly to our next panel, so I would like to thank very much Billy, Civi, Hugh, Ryan and Leo for your wonderful contributions today. Please thank them, everybody. Now I'm going to suggest that we just take a little 1-minute break just to reset. Can people go and... No, we want you to stay here, don't go anywhere. We will be continuing in just a minute. We're just going to take a little reset for you.
Sorry, everyone. We're running a bit behind, so we're going to go after a couple of minutes into the next session. If you do need to leave, of course, go to the bathroom, but we're going to keep going. For our panellists, if you do need to take a break before our panel starts, we've got a couple of minutes. Thank you.
We'll be with you in just a minute.
My name's Sue Tate. I'm a Kamilaroi woman. I'm now a community elder. My mother was born in Barraba, lived up there after my mother died with my uncle. At 17 I went nursing and I spent 38 years as a nurse, travelling around doing lots of things until there wasn't really anything left for me to do. So I resigned from nursing and I started working in community. First of all being on the Aboriginal Advisory Committee with Council, and then became part of the Justice Health team as an official visitor, and now I go and listen to the Koori boys with what they would like to talk about, and created a few yarning circles at the detention centres and getting them into their culture. I'm active in community as a resource, but as far as delivering community events like the Aboriginal Film Festival, Black Lives Matter, connecting the youth to country. I started off working in community with the Aboriginal AAC. I also started the Reconciliation Committee at Blue Mountains Hospital, and from there won a few awards, got things happening with, you know, Aboriginal culture, to show people that we are Aboriginal and this is our place. I decided to go into broadcasting and work for Koori Radio, which was deadly with music and politics and holistically letting people know what's going on in the country with Aboriginal people. Native tea tree, that is so medicinal as an antiseptic, absolutely beautiful. When I was on the Aboriginal Advisory Committee, which I was on for 20 years after I separated from my husband, I was looking for somewhere to live and I was struggling with the rent, and I got a lot of support from Tribal Council, Blue Mountains Council, and the commitment of the committee to keep me on. So through letters and process, I got a house. That's Cookie Boy. Come on. Come on. No, you're not going to do it, are you? Here I am in my beautiful house that I got from Aboriginal Housing, which I spend a lot of time working in the garden. I walk my dogs, I connect to country, and hopefully I connect to people in the right way. I'm very thankful to be in social housing.
Hello, can you, we have sound. Thank you all very much for getting back so quickly. We're going to crack on with our panel 2. So, and just so you know that you were watching a video there featuring Sue, who's a social housing tenant, telling her story. And we have more stories on the Link Wentworth website, like Mary's, like Sue's. As we all heard, stories are often a great way of getting across some powerful points. So do check out those personal stories on the website. Now, our second panel today is how can community, government and business work together to deliver solutions? I'm going to welcome our panellists to the stage and introduce them to you, and we'll get underway. Our panellists are Karen Karkas, who is Head of Housing Strategy at ANZ. Karen has 20 years' experience in government policy and housing. At ANZ, she leads the bank's commitment to improving the availability of suitable and affordable housing options, including the supply of homes to buy, homes to rent, and access to safe accommodation. Karen, thanks so much for being here today. Next up, Nicole Woodrow, Development Director at Landcom. Welcome, Nicole. She's a multi-award-winning town planner and has spent many years working in the development industry. She's also worked in the seniors living and aged care sector, and was the chair of the Seniors Committee with the Urban Development Institute of Australia. Associate Professor Ray Dufty-Jones from the Centre for Western Sydney is also joining us. Welcome, Ray. Ray's research has traced the history of housing crises in New South Wales and investigated the locational aspirations of public housing tenants. Andrew Mcnulty, many of us here already know him, CEO of Link Wentworth. Andrew is a respected community housing figure both nationally and internationally. He's delivered social, affordable and large-scale urban renewal projects for more than 25 years across Australia and the United Kingdom. And last but not least, Rod Faring is the Executive Chairman of Frasers Property Australia and the Chair of the National Affordable Housing Alliance. And here he is. He's joining us via Zoom. Good morning to you, Rod.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to see you. Thanks for your time today, and welcome to all of the panel. Great to have you here. Rod, I'm going to kick off with you because you're staring down from us above.
I feel almost
So,
regal.
how do you, I know this is a very broad question. How do you think the various sectors can work together to solve this housing crisis in Greater Western Sydney and across Australia?
Well, I've been listening in a little bit earlier, and I think the word a systemic approach came up in virtually each of the, well, certainly the last panel and in a couple of presentations earlier. I think we've got a broken system, and for a systemic approach to be adopted, we need, the fundamental ingredient for that is the need for alignment. And that means clear accountability for who does what. And unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have alignment between either our levels of government or the various players within that those levels of government, and most importantly, the incentives that are provided for encouraging outcomes, desired outcomes from a policy perspective. So I think a revisitation of the framework within which a system can be realigned and rendered more accountable for outcomes and enabled in its ability to be able to balance demand and supply. Unfortunately, we've got the populist approach towards the provision of incentivising demand for home ownership. Nothing wrong with that. But if it's absent a supply response, because that's the state's responsibility and nothing is addressed at that level, what you end up doing is basically just fueling house price inflation, which I think is counterproductive to the purpose.
Okay, thanks for that, Rod. So Rod's just basically said the system is broken, we need a whole realignment. And so I'd just like to ask the panel in general if we could just go around, what roles do you see your respective organisations playing in this kind of realignment? How can we achieve it? Karen, let's start off with you.
Sure, thank you. Look, I think from a financial services perspective, for those of you that may not know, ANZ has a $10 billion target around trying to deliver affordable and social housing supply into the market as well as accessible. And so we take that quite seriously in terms of trying to focus on how do we scale up solutions, right? So we, at this stage, we're 3 and a bit years in, and we've done over $4 billion of finance into the sector. And what we've really focused on is where we can align public policy solutions with private sector investment, innovation that also then ties into not-for-profits and also government objectives. So really being able to take that partnership role in order to try to bring new supply outcomes to market. We focus very much on the supply side, not the demand side where possible, but some of those are hybrid solutions. So for example, in Victoria, you would have seen something like the Assemble model, which is a build to rent to own. And what we like about that is it provides security of tenure and removes the chasing of the deposit and the market. So you get that long time to be able to save in order to actually then move directly into housing that you know is quality of build, you know your neighbors, and you've got the ability to opt in or out of that. But you've been given sort of that security. And I think much to Leo's point around, 6 years in rental, this is that 5-year time frame to really help people stabilize and have those opportunities in the absence of what I would describe as, not having a decent basic requirements around what we see in the rental sector. So I think the finance sector has a huge opportunity there. And I guess the other thing I would say is very much around also being able to scale up these solutions, right? So the rest of the institutional sector can actually then invest, because if we can prove that up and do the due diligence, then you can actually deliver that from one pilot project and roll it out, which is often where we see governments fail.
Okay, thanks for that. Nicole, tell us a little bit more about Landcom's role.
Sure. So Landcom has a commitment to deliver at least 10% affordable housing in its projects. So we've taken that challenge on and have found a couple of pilot projects to try and target some of the barriers that we have encountered in delivering affordable housing. So we've been fortunate to find Link Wentworth as a partner on 2 of those projects, and it was very important, as Rod mentioned, to find that common alignment in the partnerships to make sure we had similar values in terms of the projects and the outcomes we were trying to achieve. But it did highlight a lot of the barriers that we have to encounter from the development sector to deliver affordable housing. And some of those relay around access to land, which we were fortunate to be able to use our land in the first instance, but accessing capital, planning pathways, incentives and dispensations. The sector needs to be able to deliver affordable housing. So the alignment has been very important, finding a partnership that you have common values and you want to deliver the same outcome, and then sourcing other stakeholders and partners as well. So in those projects we have been working with NIFIC and DCJ and trying to secure the best group of stakeholders to deliver the project. And I think it's very important, because it's very difficult to do these projects, to get those common alignments and those common partnerships and deliver the project that way.
Okay. Ray, you've researched the history of these housing crises and possibly some solutions as well. Why are we failing so much at the moment?
I think just kind of to go back to what my industry does, and it kind of talks about policy and what are the big issues around policy. And I think probably the thing that's staring us in the face and kind of came to a head in 2010 or 2009, 2008, and most recently with the COVID crisis, is that actually our housing industry is now too big to fail. In the same way that banks were too big to fail in the US, our housing industry was too big to fail, particularly when COVID hit. And you saw, probably a coalition government do what nobody thought they would do, and that was the job seeker and job keeper system. And that was in response to the fact that housing in Australia is now too big to fail. Too many people are invested up to the hilt, and we see the canary in the coal mine in terms of social housing. But I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So when we say, government can't afford to invest in this, the Australian society and government can't afford not to. Government can't afford to ignore this problem. This problem raised its head when we had the global financial crisis, and now with the COVID-19 experience. If we fail to solve this problem, we may not have the opportunity to be able to head it off at the pass the way we did in those last 2 instances. So I quake at the thought of incentivising, asking business to lead government in the solution, because we actually need government to solve this. And it does require the investment of billions of dollars. So, and history shows us that they can do that. And it's apolitical in many ways. We saw both Chifley and Menzies do this and invest in billions of dollars when we had a huge housing supply crisis at the end of World War II. Now, why we can't do that this time around is beyond me.
That's the big question. Okay, well, let's bring in Andrew now. Andrew, you're putting on this big debate. What are you hoping to achieve? How do you think we can get all of these different sectors involved?
Well, I think Rod mentioned at the very beginning, he said the system's broken, the housing system's broken, and also every day I'm reading something new about the housing crisis. But there isn't a sense of urgency around how the problem could be solved. And if I've heard this 1,000 times, I've probably heard it far more than that, the idea around there's no silver bullet. And I think the phrase, there's no silver bullet, allows people and allows us all to put this in the too hard basket and realise, let's just celebrate if your landlord rents have gone up and you've got a better yield. Let's just celebrate if you own a house, you've got a more valuable asset, because there's no silver bullet to resolve this. And what's been demonstrated this morning so far is I think there is a lot of individual will from the private sector, from government, from not-for-profits to solve it. But what we need to do is we need to step up and say, this is why we're calling, and so many organisations are calling out for a national housing strategy. And Leo, really resonated what you said there. If you have a national housing strategy, then you have a vision, and it's not about profits or returns. Of course, that has to be part of the mechanism. It's about how do you bring various partners together to deliver a solution for a fairer, more inclusive Australia, which looks after its population and business and the economy, as was mentioned earlier as well. A lot of, by Ryan Banting from Australian Unity, having workers who have secure homes means that businesses can thrive. If there's instability around employees' accommodation, then businesses will struggle to attract and retain people. So I think there's a lot of political will. I think there's a lot of corporate will and community will. But actually, how do we link it up so we can scale it up? Which is why it's not about a policy or a strategy that goes in a bottom drawer and no one thinks about. We want innovative solutions to layer up public investment with private investment, with money coming through and delivery vehicles from different areas so we can do this at scale. There's definitely the will. We just can't continue to say there's no silver bullet and then not do anything about a housing crisis. We have to take it seriously.
I mean, I wonder how much of the strategy, you know, there are some tough questions to be asked about regulation. Private industry doesn't often like a lot of regulation. But Rod, if I can throw this back to you, Rod Faring, do you think property developers should have more of a responsibility to deliver social and affordable housing? And should we, you know, should they have actual hard targets? If they're going to be making a lot of money out of a development, then, you know, should they be compelled to devote some of that to affordable housing?
Well, I'll put my other hat on then as a developer, chairman of a development company. The first comment I'd make is that no one needs to be accredited to be a developer. Anyone who controls a bit of land or has a desire one morning to go out and do something can be called a developer. So I think putting everyone in the same basket as developers can tend to oversimplify the need for a response. But having made that, the second point is to be an effective contributor to the provision of any housing at all, whether it be for market, for profit, or build to rent, or any type of housing. You need consent. Consent from a planning perspective and consent from a building perspective. Now, at Naha and certainly in Fraser's, we've delivered, yes, mixed-use projects. We're delivering projects redeveloping public land. We're doing all those sort of things, mixed tenure with social housing, redeveloping public housing estates, etc. But again, they're one-offs. And we need a more comprehensive approach to enable broad-based, scalable, large-scale investment in social housing delivered through the mainstream housing market. Now, the mainstream housing market invests on average about 150 to 160 billion a year. If we took 15% of that, which is the infrastructure contribution that is levied by local and state governments, whether it be taxes and charges, and we took $1,500 per application, not in addition to, but as a part of that contribution, you generate enough capital to deliver about 3,500 to 4,000 dwellings per annum by virtue of reprioritising social and affordable housing as a part of the overall infrastructure, just as necessary as headworks for a sewage treatment plant or road intersections and such. The mainstream development industry is delivering enough capital into the market to be able to afford, within the context of its current obligations, the provision of a small amount of capital which can then be used to actually crowd in and use competition to effectively create sufficient incentive for the private sector to bridge the funding gaps between what would otherwise be a mainstream commercial development to a mixed tenure type of development that will deliver social and affordable housing on an ongoing basis. The opportunity to do that comes down to the will at state and local government level, and importantly at the federal government level, to recognise that if you join those pieces together, you can take the incentives you're currently committed to and you can effectively leverage an enormous amount of additional capital to bridge the gap.
Thanks for that, Rod. I mean, given the extent of this national housing crisis, it is kind of astonishing, I guess, that it's not more front and centre in the federal election campaign, and I'm wondering why that is. Ray, I mean, you might have something to say about that.
I think historically coalition governments have been reluctant to get involved in issues of urban planning. They see it as not part of their remit because of the Constitution. Labor governments do tend to be more interested in national planning in that sense. I think they don't want to talk about it because they don't want people to realise how bad it is in some ways. I do think that no side at the moment has a solution per se, notwithstanding some of those initial announcements. But it is a big issue. It is going to require a lot of money, and it's going to require federal government intervention. And I don't know why they're not trying to address it now, because it's not going away, and it will only be much worse if we don't see something done about it in the future.
And the economic case for it is actually very strong.
Absolutely. From a policy perspective, one of the really simple things that we could do is shift the way we do our cost-benefit analyses. And I know this is really boring. People probably go to sleep as soon as you hear cost-benefit analysis. But the concept of the wider economic impact or outcome of transport infrastructure, for example, is being investigated. Now, if we consider housing as an infrastructure, and we think about those wider economic impacts, so those wider communities, those labour force opportunities, if we had government take those into account when they do a cost-benefit analysis of investing in public or social housing, then suddenly that becomes a lot more viable as well. So it's governments thinking through the policy mechanisms that they also have as a way of addressing this.
Okay, thanks.
It's a really important point. Sorry to interrupt, but Spiller Gibbons Swan have just completed a study on exactly that issue from the point of view of evaluating what are the costs that the community bears for not addressing this problem, whether it be perhaps poor labour outcomes from a productivity point of view, education, health, domestic violence, etc., etc. About 54 billion in present value terms is the net saving to other public programs, be they state or federal, that flow through government budgets if we were able to achieve a balanced housing market. So that document will be published in the near term, but it's addressing exactly that point that was just raised, and it delivers a cost-benefit ratio of about 1.93, which is better than better than about a half a dozen currently funded transport projects, including Metro Rail in Melbourne.
Okay, thanks for that, Rod. Karen, I wonder if I could bring you in now to respond to what Rod has said, and also you've had a lot of experience working with government policy.
Yeah, look, I think one of the great challenges here, I mean, you're seeing a consistency throughout the day, right? Which is this issue of having a certainty about what we're trying to solve for, who we're trying to solve for, and, you know, sort of having a broader sort of range of targets to understand. I think there's always this rapid agreement here, but where we fall down is sort of those responses. So traditionally, we've seen situations where no matter which flavor of government gets in, that they create a range of policies, they tweak them, you know, sort of to suit, they start them out, and then they let them go, right? And so we constantly have a situation in which all the elements that need to gear up and scale and respond are constantly resetting to pilots, they're constantly resetting to money with sunset clauses, they're constantly resetting to a change of prioritization. We see it all the time in state and federal government. Is social the priority? Is affordable the priority? Often, almost entirely, rental is left out of that equation, so security of tenure becomes set aside in exchange for, you know, a home ownership agenda, which we saw included in the last NAHA agreement. So I think the real challenge here is to be able to have that consistent approach. You know, unfortunately, you say bipartisan, but just the reality of being able to set things in motion the same way we do in other parts of investment, be it education, health, etc., that actually allows, you know, sort of all players to engage and do what they know how to do to support that and to deliver scale and lasting change.
Andrew, I want to ask you, you've worked overseas as well, obviously, and I'm presuming in the UK, and I'm wondering if there are any lessons that, you know, we can learn from other countries.
Well, I think the scaling up thing is something we can learn from the UK. You know, I think there's a lot of real examples that we're delivering in Australia. We've got a youth foyer we're building in Penrith with Platform Youth Services, a women's shelter in the Hawkesbury we're building as well. There's lots of things we're doing locally. The stuff we're doing with Landcom is, you know, is exceptional. I'm really looking forward to handing keys over. So we need to celebrate what we're actually doing. But what I've seen in America, Canada, and the UK is that urgency and that moving towards it being a bipartisan issue where people say, let's put the best minds to say, how do we do this over a 20, 30, 40-year period? So when there's been changes of governments, different governments have a different flavour about how they take the policy forward, but they take the policy forward. It's not sort of we stop the policy. And also the various agencies, a lot of it came bottom up, and I can see that here in terms of some of our really good Sydney councils in different parts of Sydney saying, we are hearing this so much from our constituents and our key workers and the parents of young people and the people who've got parents in aged care and the like, and they're saying, this might not be an election campaign issue, but locally it's a major issue. So local government's almost been pushing up, and I think state government taking more. What I've seen in the UK, you're getting a full response more. And I think that's been a massive thing. So you're not just getting short-term token policies, you're getting long-term investment. And that's seeing community housing providers in the UK now owning over 2 million homes in the UK. From 30 years ago, it was such a small sector. And that's because people have seen, how do you leverage in the private sector, how do you leverage in government support, and how do you actually work with organisations like not-for-profits as a conduit to deliver change? Because banks, builders, developers, they want certainty. Consultants want income flows. So this is about jobs. The only other thing I'd like to add, Juanita, is there is more of a realisation that it is a value, that there is a value being created and a saving to the economy, as opposed to it being purely seen as a cost. I think in Australia we get caught up very, very quickly about how will we pay for it, not what is the benefit. So I share some of the comments that were, really, Mary's story. I shared with Shane and I didn't know you were going on straight after, but I shared with Shane, we could almost have stopped the debate then when Mary spoke, because what you said was so eloquent and so powerful, and it really sort of shared what the whole purpose is. And then your story, Shane, as well. I think that was so fantastic for you to share that around the stability it gave your family and the springboard it gave your family. This is an investment in Australia's future. And I think it should be a bipartisan issue that we say, how do we do it? How do we come together to do it?
And what seems to be coming through over and over again is this lack of long-term planning and commitment. I know 20 years ago when I lived in London, there was a huge discussion around the lack of affordable housing for key workers, and there were literally not enough nurses, teachers, ambulance drivers, firefighters. They couldn't live anywhere within London, and so I understand, I believe that there was some action taken there, but here we seem to just react after the event.
And I think the segue you've given me there, a lot of the ideas, this might sound a bit perverse, but a lot of the ideas and the companies who are delivering a lot of affordable and social housing in the UK, look at any planning department in the UK, in London, it is filled with top quality planners from Australia, developers from Australia, financiers from Australia, pension funds from Australia. They are funding social and delivering social and affordable housing in the UK because there's a policy and a framework around how they do it and how they invest in the long term. Yeah. We need that stability and that strength of policy in Australia.
Actually, I want to... sorry, go on, Rod, and then I want to bring in Nicole.
Just a systemic approach.
Yeah, that's right.
All it comes down to. Yeah.
Nicole, as a town planner, of course, you've probably got very firm views on this and about having essential workers and about having, a community that's diverse and comprised of all the different kinds of people we want to be around who contribute in different ways. What have you got to say about that in terms of the town planning aspect?
I think Rod mentioned it a little bit earlier, integral to affordable housing is being able to get your approvals, whether they're building approvals and planning approvals. And unfortunately, we have a very complex planning system in New South Wales. And we really do need to have an opportunity, I feel, to create pathways where you can deliver affordable housing that really is more straightforward and offers dispensation and incentives for developers to come in, and not-for-profits and the like, to be able to have nice, clear planning ways. They know on a particular site what they can do, what they can achieve in terms of affordable housing. The system really doesn't really cater for the ability to address that housing need, and it's often expensive and time-consuming. And I think that there's a great community sentiment that we do need affordable housing. And there are small concessions now being made towards SEP 70 and the like, where there are the ability to accumulate some funds for affordable housing, but it's just not enough. So it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience to find a site that has the right approval process for you to achieve the housing outcome you're after.
Ray, we are focusing on the Western Sydney area today in particular. So I'd just like to ask you, in terms of the population. It's diverse, lots of migrants, like to bring in, you know, how well do we meet the needs of First Nations people in this area? How do you think things are going, and how could they be better?
That's a big gamut. I think the other thing that's missing is that Western Sydney's population is really young. So when we're talking about a generation missing out on the opportunities that previous generations have, we're talking about Western Sydney missing out on those opportunities, where Western Sydney used to be the source of opportunities for housing. I am very worried about those students that I teach, whether they will have the opportunity to own a home in the way that previous generations did. So that is probably one of the key issues. I think some of the other issues around multifamily homes and overcrowding in Western Sydney is part of the issue. But I think one of the other things that, and if I can go back to the history side, is that I think Western Sydney got kind of tarred with the negativity associated with public and social housing. And I think we fail to recognise actually through the stories that we've just heard today is that actually it was a real success story. I think we've let the narratives of the 1970s really tarnish what was a real achievement of the 40s, 50s and 60s. It was industry innovation. You know, you saw the development of the big developers like AV Jennings. They got their start through public housing and social housing, the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement. Government leading business, allowing industry to innovate. We saw the innovation or the development of prefabricated building materials, which allowed us to overcome, construction costs and make housing more affordable through that innovation. And so I look at it now and I think, well, why can't we use that ingenuity and that innovation today? Why can't we take, some of that amazing work that engineers at UNSW have done around waste and the challenges of waste that we experience in Western Sydney and turn that waste to building materials? Why can't government invest in that and invest in public housing through that? Why can't we innovate around other types of engineered prefabricated buildings and things? So I think Western Sydney could be the place where we see that innovation and opportunity around housing, whether it's in the policy, social housing front, as well as the development of more affordable, world-leading practices as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. That's a great thing. As you point out, there's a lot to be proud of, and a lot of great people who've come out of that, of being able to have a stable start in life. Andrew, can I just ask you why you think community housing providers are best equipped to partner with government and business to come up with solutions, particularly when you've got vulnerable communities?
Well, I suppose I wouldn't be as blunt as to say we're the best situated to do it, but we're very well situated to do that because as a not-for-profit sector, we do actually make profit. We do aim to sort of but then recycle that back into more outcomes. We have to be solvent businesses to scale up and do more. But I think we are in that sweet spot around being able to work with governments without an inquiry or anyone going to ICAT to talk about ideas and scaling up and opportunities because as a not-for-profit sector we recycle. But then we do need the private sector in order to scale up the delivery of those opportunities. So I think there is an unusual sweet spot there in terms of being a catalyst that can work with government around developing policies if we're allowed to actually have proper conversations about what innovation actually means and how do we leverage the asset in Western Sydney of 50,000 social housing homes that we've heard about earlier, generally, and the older portfolio that needs investment. So effectively, we're saying there's an asset which could be a problem, will shortly be a problem, and we've got around a 30,000 home shortfall by 2036. So we've got a number of pieces, we've got a growing economy, we've got so many things in Western Sydney that are on the plus side, but unless we innovate, we're going to be stuck. And that's where I think the unique point is for the community housing sector. We're in a position where we can have conversations with the likes of Landcom and ANZ Bank and say, how do we bring you in? How do we play a role and act as a conduit to scale these opportunities up? And maybe I think, try not to reference people too much, but Leo, again, I think one of our unique selling points is we are tenant-focused organisations. We don't get it right all the time, but we are focused on our mission isn't to be a developer, it isn't to be a financier, it isn't to be government. Our mission and vision is to provide house for people in which they can build a future. So our mission's pretty simple. We want to be a catalyst for positive change. So it's almost like we can be a vehicle to sell those stories and tell them. And you know, Mary's amazing, but we have 10,000 people living in our homes. Over half of them are in Western Sydney. We've got a lot of people who've had stability as a result of us being around and us being a conduit from existing New South Wales government policies and the like. So we are one of the solutions, but I think we only really can make the most of that if we act as a conduit with the private sector and the government.
Okay, yeah, so you've got all of that great local knowledge and you've got your own ideas for solutions. Do you feel that you do have enough access to levels of government to put that forward?
Look, I think there's a complication around short-term policies or no policies at different levels of government. I think, I'm on social media a bit, but I think social media in sound bites takes away from, again, long-term policy. So I think there is momentum in some areas, but we're almost trying to grab the momentum by staging these sort of events before a federal election, which is nicely timed. We organised this 6 months ago and it's turned out to be at a good time. But also with things like, you know, our case study projects, like I mentioned, you know, our youth foray in Penrith, to get people out to see how valuable that is. The two projects we're doing with Lancome, there's one in Macquarie Park, which is the biggest one we'll be undertaking, and actually celebrate with partners how well that's going to work, and actually then say, okay, how do we do 2 of them next year, rather than sort of, so we have to sort of push the boundaries a bit.
Okay, we are getting close to time, but I want to go back to something that Ray mentioned, and that is young people. Let's finish on that note. Do we have Angus Lonergan here from... Angus, there you are. Angus has got a question for us.
Hi, thanks so much. I've been working with young people for about the past 10 years. Myself was a young person during that time. And
we all remember.
Over the past 10 years, the young people that I work with and myself have come to realise that home ownership is never going to become a reality for us. And that is both in rent and actually being able to purchase a house. Does anybody in the audience speak with regularly to young people about their housing needs, not just children of your own? And if so, what do you learn from them?
Yeah, let's just put that to everyone in the panel. Let's just close on that. Rod, do you talk to young people about their situation, what they're facing?
Directly, it's limited to children, unfortunately, and the Bank of Mum and Dad has been active in that regard. But the answer is that our marketing suite talks to, on average, around about 2,500 to 3,000 people a week, of which from all walks of life. The consistent theme that comes through is a consistent hope for the ability to be able to gain access to housing, but of one shape or form. But the inevitable trading back of expectations is inevitable. If you're talking about new product, we don't really have much perspective on established product other than the push factor that comes from the existing market for people who want to get out of unstable tenancy arrangements and into more stable housing arrangements that they can afford. And increasingly that means that they trade down their expectations on a consistent basis. So I don't think that there is as much resignation to the idea that it's not possible to gain secure and long-term housing. There is a perennial hope for that. I think interest rates and the threat of interest rate rising is going to make it more difficult for banks to lend. Although, unfortunately, with the deposit guarantee, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, hopefully that deposit guarantee does not get capitalised into house prices, and that it does make it possible for people to gain entry to housing with a much smaller deposit than has been the case hitherto. But I think there is not as much resignation out there as you might think on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is serious concern that the solutions are not apparent, and they're certainly not widespread.
Okay, thanks, Rod. Would anybody else like to jump in there?
I wouldn't mind adding, just in terms of Link Wentworth work with 4 amazing youth charities, and I think it's a particularly, we talk about often the more appealing sides of homelessness in terms of what the market might pick up, around whether it's older women, people can appreciate older women should be housed. I think young people are a neglected picture within that segment and within the news, because there is an expectation, work harder, and the cliche of eat less avocados and you'll do better. But through our 4 youth charities, I think the pressure on young people is enormous. Homelessness pressure on young people is incredible. And then I think that with the youth allowance being so low, people's actual opportunity to get a tenancy and maintain a tenancy is virtually nil, if not nil. So I think there is a massive issue here around how young people not get into their first rental on their own, or how they get into home ownership, but how they actually almost survive if they haven't got the support of mum and dad, never mind the bank of mum and dad, or a wider extended family. So young people, and through our small interaction on this youth foyer we're doing, and St George have done a wonderful youth foyer in the city as well, I think it is a critical area we need to focus on, because we all say, young people are the future, but if we're not careful, we're going to be creating such a problem, which is going to be a legacy problem for the next 50, 60 years, rather than a solution and a springboard to positive futures.
Thanks for that. Ray, would you like to say some closing words?
Yeah, look, I've been teaching those young people. It was a jarring experience when I realised I wasn't one of those young people anymore as well. But I've been teaching at Western Sydney University now for 12 years, and yeah, there is a level of despondency. The number of students who now continue to live at home, not during their undergraduate years, but during their postgraduate years, when they're like in their mid-20s, still living with their mum and dad, heading into their 30s living with their mum and dad because they can't afford the rent, let alone thinking of buying a house. My parents-in-law bought their first home in Lakemba for $25,000 in 1977. And my father was appalled at the thought that I was spending nearly $500,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment, not realising just how much things had changed in one generation. So it's that kind of reality, and I know I do feel frustrated with older generations that they don't realise that huge disparity. They've very much benefited from that enormous increase in wealth, and there's simple things that can be done that, huge political fear campaigns are built around, capital gains tax exemptions for private, for those who own more than one home, just seems like an appalling idea, and it's producing these huge inequalities. So the only way you're going to get into a house is if your parents were wealthy enough and had the foresight to buy, more than one home, so that they can then, sell that home to give you a foot into the market. And that just goes against the egalitarian nature or the character that so many Australians hold near and dear. So
thanks, Ray, for those closing remarks. Well said, well said. Thanks for the question, Angus. That was great. I think we could probably talk for a lot longer about that. That opened a can of worms, but thank you very much for that talking point. Now, unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I'd just like to thank all of the panel members today who've been so generous with your time. It's been great to have you and great to have your expertise. Rod, thanks for joining us via Zoom. So please, let's give them a round of applause as they leave the stage. And Andrew, I'm going to ask for you to stay back, though, to give us some closing remarks. It has been an absolute whirlwind today, hasn't it? Gosh, we've got so much to think about.
Well, I maybe truncate what I was going to say, but just a few closing comments I wanted to mention. The Big Housing Debate's been an event put on by Link Wentworth in partnership with Western Sydney Community Forum, which we've hoped just to stimulate the conversation, because we believe this is a critical issue. We wholeheartedly believe that everyone has a right to a decent home. And I do believe, I'm an optimist by nature and by experience, that I do believe by working with people who share those values, you can do more than trying to work on your own or being negative about the current status quo. I think there is an opportunity now to push forward and try and do more. And I would encourage us to in all our different roles, to take this on as a challenge and not rely on the mantra of there's no silver bullet, but actually say, what can I personally do and what can my company do to actually make change happen? Rose mentioned the word infrastructure, and I love the word infrastructure, and I think infrastructure is such an important word when we think about social and affordable housing. I think the pre-word which has been missing within Australia is essential infrastructure. So I think we need to be saying more and more that social and affordable housing is an essential part of the makeup of every well-functioning city within this country, and especially Western Sydney, where there is so much demand and there is so much opportunity. I'm delighted that we were able to have the Deloitte report launched today, so I'm very grateful to the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue and the various other community housing providers that helped fund that report. I won't mention statistics that I was going to mention. I'll take the point that we've had enough statistics, but there is around, the one I will mention, there's around 32% of Western Sydney's renting population is in housing stress. That was a figure that was mentioned earlier, but 32% of Western Sydney's renters are in housing stress. And I do want CHPs, community housing providers like Link Wentworth and Evolve and St George and Bridge and Hume, there's quite a few good ones. We've got quite a few good ones in Sydney. I want us to be part of the solution, as I mentioned earlier, by working in partnership with local, state and federal governments and the private sector to actually do more than talking, but be part of actually providing more homes for people. And what needs to change for that to happen? CHEER National, the Community Housing Industry Association, has recently issued a report, and I agree with this completely. There are 4 bullet points that they've established. One is a national housing strategy and a national housing plan. That is probably the most important thing that needs to happen, with clear targets that the innovative people around this room and around this country can actually get onto and actually say, okay, how do we deliver? How do we build more homes? How do we make more money if we're bankers, developers, builders? That's appropriate. But how do we deliver as part of a national housing strategy which delivers more homes for people who need them? A bipartisan annual target. So post-election, we hope we can move towards funding and investment nationally to the benefit of Western Sydney and the whole of New South Wales, but national targets that filter down into state and regional parts of New South Wales. The continued expansion of NIFIC. I think the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation is one of the biggest things that's happened in Australia in the last 5 years. But we need to positively exploit that platform. Adrian, the chairman's in the audience, and very grateful for Adrian being in the audience. NIFIC has done an enormous first step. It's got now an increased mantle to put $5.5 billion of cheap debt into the community housing sector and elsewhere. It needs to be layered up with other forms of policy rather than seen as the only policy from a federal position. We need to renew and replace our existing older stock and look at lifetime purpose and cost in use and heating and cooling and mould. We need to look at that and not just think it's only about new supply. And then ownership is a big thing, but we need to think about people who are in rented accommodation, existing rent accommodation. What is their pathway if some of those people wanted to transition to shared ownership or full ownership? As was mentioned earlier, it's okay to talk about it, but if people have no other accessible option, then they actually have no option. I wanted to actually congratulate the New South Wales Government on something very specific which is close to my heart, and that is the Together Home programme. And I think it does actually demonstrate what can be done. And it was initially a health response to rough sleeping and the risk of rough sleeping during the pandemic. But what the sizable investment from the New South Wales Government went into rehousing some of the most marginal and most at-risk people within our community into home which also had support. Link Wentworth is the largest provider of Together Home accommodation in the state. We have 155 highly vulnerable people who have moved into Link Wentworth, either owned, leased properties with support wrapped around them. And that is providing amazing benefits to those people and to the wider society. I won't go into detail, just partly in terms of time, but I will make concise a short case study around someone who I'll call Julie. Julie is now 27 and was shamefully homeless, not for her shame, but for our shame. She was street homeless since the age of 22. So she was 5 years on the street. She had various mental health issues which developed further from being on the street, and a number of wider medical issues. She lost contact with all her family with the exception of her mother, and was in a fairly spiralling situation. Through the Together Home programme, Julie was provided with a stable, secure home and wraparound support. And 1 year on, I had the great benefit of seeing a letter which she wrote to one of our staff called Shani, where she talked about the first time she's had real stability in her life, that over the last period of time she's moved away from thinking herself as being a complete failure and all her life experiences being her fault, rather than now seeing that there's a positive future for her. She had a whole series of interventions in the medical system and in various other parts of our system which cost our society money, every negative intervention, but more importantly cost her dramatically. And now as a 27-year-old, she has a path and a future to have a more successful future, and for her family to have a more successful future. So I'm incredibly proud of the support workers that we work with and the organisations we work with, and all the Link Wentworth staff, because every time we have a positive interaction with Julie, or many people like Julie, we are on the road to becoming a more fair society, and also, importantly from an economic point of view, saving the state money. So I think we can do the best thing, the right thing, and invest in social and affordable housing, and also have the double whammy, the holy grail of saving our country money by doing the right thing. So this isn't a cost. I go back to, this is an investment. Final things, I'd just like to say a few thank yous. I won't go on too exhaustively, but I'd like to especially mention Mary. You know, I thought you were amazing. I didn't know what you were going to talk about, and I know in the reception I said, you'll be fine. But there is about 150 people in the room, and there's a bit over 500 people online. So there's quite a big audience of over 600 people here. So, but you were the star, I think. And Auntie Carol, for your warm welcome, I really appreciate that, and that resonates with me. And every time I hear an acknowledgement or welcome to country, it really resonates with me about how much more we need to do in terms of listening and doing, to work alongside our First Nations people and respect our First Nations people's journey. I'd like to thank Billy and the team from the Western Sydney Community Forum. You know, it's been a real great event to put on with Western Sydney Community Forum. I'd like to thank, and I rarely do this to my shame, I'd like to thank the Link Wentworth staff, led by Brianna, who's put on this event as well. You know, it's a tremendous task to do this, but it's part of our advocacy campaign where we want to do more, we want to be thought leaders, and we want to bring people together to actually say we can do more. So thank you to the Link Wentworth team for all their work on this here, as we sort of push our vision of providing homes and building futures. And then lastly, I'd like to just acknowledge some of our partners, especially local government, our state government and federal representatives, because I think if we get this together right with the 3 layers of government and layer in with the private sector, we can actually form a cohesive and long-term solution here. Fellow CHPs, I know there's a lot of my peers and community housing providers in the audience or online, and as an series of organisations, I think we are more powerful together than working on our own. And the various peak bodies that we're members of, which are doing so much work in terms of raising consciousness and awareness. So special thanks to Wendy Hayhurst at Cheer Australia, John at Shelter New South Wales, Nicholas Proud at Power Housing, Christopher at the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue, as well as Mark Degatardi at Cheer New South Wales. But lastly, the last thing I want to do is thank Juanita, you know, for being an amazing host. You know, when I saw your smile and your personality and your red suit at the beginning, I thought, yeah, we're going to be in great hands here. So thanks, Juanita. I really appreciate your skills and everything bringing this together. And over to you. So thank you.
Thanks for giving me the last word, Andrew. No, thank you for bringing all of these different people together and starting this conversation or continuing this conversation. Let's hope that it goes on from here. For me, what I'm taking away from this debate are the personal stories that we've heard today. And what they illustrate is the profound impact that social and affordable housing can have on people's lives. And that's what we're really talking about here today, how all Australians, regardless of what their financial or personal situation is, that all of them can have access to that fundamental need, that fundamental human right for shelter. We are a wealthy country. We should be able to fix this. And today we looked at the big question, how can we fix it? I'd like to congratulate Link Wentworth and Western Sydney Community Forum for organising this event. Thank you to our distinguished guests, our expert panellists, the residents who've been so generous in sharing their stories, and of course all of you who've come along today to participate. It has been a real privilege for me to be involved in such an important conversation. Don't forget, this whole event has been recorded and will be available shortly on the Link Wentworth website. You'll also be able to access the research that's been mentioned today, the Deloitte's report and the State of the Nation report. That's all publicly available. Just Google Link Wentworth Big Housing Debate and it'll pop right up. And if you want to take some action yourself, if you're inspired by what you've heard today, we would encourage you to contact your local MP or state senator. They're elected to serve you. They are meant to get back to you and respond. And also they do have to log all of the correspondence they receive from their constituents. If there's something, you know, people feel strongly about, like the housing crisis, that might impact on what gets raised in the party room and in Parliament. So phone, email, write, ask questions, tell them what you think they should be doing. To paraphrase the wonderful Grace Tame, make some noise. A light lunch will be served in the foyer now. There is a lot to talk about and debrief, so please take some time to relax, mingle, chat to other people, and personally I hope to see you tonight on the 7 o'clock news, so tune in to the ABC. Lovely to be here, thank you.